Thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm really excited to be presenting this webinar, Understanding Sensory Motor Foundations that support feeding, eating, and mealtime participation with Therapro. Allison and I were just chatting that there's such a big need in the community to support individuals with eating and mealtime goals. So I'm really excited to be here with all of you. My background initially was in sensory integration, and I ended up sort of just by the nature of the clients I was seeing, working with a lot of individuals with eating and mealtime. And I'll introduce a little bit here on how I kind of came to sort of the clinical reasoning piece that we're going to talk about during our time together today. So this is our learning menu. So you'll see we're going to look at some sensory, motor, and psychosocial factors that influence eating and mealtime. We're really going to think about the evaluation process with those variables. We're also going to think about how our evaluation results influence how we generate achievable goals, and how those same evaluation results are going to influence the entry point of intervention for individuals with eating and mealtime goals in therapy. I'm going to move this one tech thing that's in my visual field, excuse me. It's always fun when you're adjusting things. So sorry, I'm seeing a big picture of myself that I don't need to see. So this beginning piece is a couple of things that I've seen on social media. They're not super specific. If anyone's on any feeding therapy groups on Facebook or Instagram, you'll often see quotes like this. So this one that's talking about like tips or tricks. They're trying things like food, sensory oral sequencing approaches. Can you touch it, kiss it, and those things? And people are really asking for help on what do I do with this person. And you'll see a similar with this particular quote that the person is, thinking about this individual that just eats crust of pizza and what steps that they would take. And these quotes, whenever I see these dialogues, and people often have great suggestions on Facebook, which I think is a great platform for sort of reaching a wide variety of people. Whenever I see these, I think, I wonder why that individual is eating like that. Like, why are they just eating the crust? And I think they really speak to me about how important, when I see these, they really speak to me about how important comprehensive evaluation is. Because before we get to the what of what we do with someone in therapy sessions, we have to understand their why. Because people have restrictive eating patterns for a variety of different reasons. We really want to be thinking about like what's creating this experience for that person, so we can do really targeted and effective therapy. So there's lots of great treatment techniques that they're kind of mentioning in some of these posts, but the idea of, if we can really zoom in on why that person's experiencing their food interactions like that, that helps us provide much more effective therapy. So I like to just kind of start with those. So what are some reasons that families seek support for their child's eating and mealtime abilities? So this, and people probably have a variety of ones that come up depending on the population that you work with. Some of the ones that I see in my population that I work with is I get a lot of individuals that the parents are saying it takes forever for their child to eat, that the child has very few foods that they're willing to eat and is very particular about how the food looks and how they're prepared. I hear a lot of social concerns around eating and mealtime. The person has a hard time eating at a friend's home, restaurants, or school cafeteria. The parent often feeling like a short order cook with it, which is very stressful, especially when it's blended with the second one, which is if it doesn't come out the right way, the child's not going to eat it. And then this last one, I feel like this one's been coming up more with the population and the group of people that I work with, which is the impact of their diet on their energy and health. So I do work with young children, and I do work with elementary age and actually teenagers and some adults. And these things, they're a little bit different from person to person, but a lot of them are very similar, just in different social contexts and different situations. So these are some pretty common reasons that individuals end up seeking out occupational therapy for eating and mealtime therapy. So when we think about what are some of these reasons a child in a family might have these eating and mealtime experiences, we know that this can be really vast and different, and it's usually a unique dynamic that exists within each sort of individual and family. So this is a beginning list, and we're going to dive into these as we kind of go through the evaluation process today. The person's sensory processing capacities might impact their eating and mealtime experiences. Their posture and respiration, can they sit in the chair and have coordinated breath while they're eating? Do they have developed interoceptive awareness, specifically as it relates to eating and mealtime? Do they know if they're hungry, thirsty? Do they understand their sort of digestion? And do they have good interoceptive awareness outside of meals in terms of emotional regulation, which can have impact in meals as well? What is the person's previous mealtime experiences? Have mealtimes always been really stressful? How are they experiencing the environment that they're in and the foods that are being presented? What's the regulation state of the individual and the family? This family piece is one you'll see where we could do workshops on all these sort of individual topics, but that idea of how is that child or individual showing up, and how is their family showing up in meals, and how is that impacting their eating and mealtime experience? What is the individual's medical history? What was did they have food allergies? Do they have swallowing challenges? What are some of the mechanisms that might be going on? And things like reflux and things. What are some things that are currently happening, and also what exists in their history that might be influencing how they experience meals? Does an individual have a trauma history? And that could be, related to eating and mealtime or not. Some traumatic events, some of the clients I've worked for can be directly related to the client. So the person having an actual choking episode. I worked with the family a few years ago that the mother had a sibling that had a choking incident, and that was really impacting her child's mealtime experience because it was so stressful for her. What is the attachment like between family members is something you want to think about. Does the individual have the fine motor skills they need for things like using utensils and opening packages and those kind of parts of mealtime? Do they have the bilateral skills that they need to do things like cut with a fork and a knife? What does the individual's oral motor skills look like? How does that contribute to chewing skills and swallowing skills? What is the person's oral awareness? Do they have good awareness of food in their mouth? Is the food all the way chewed up? Where is it in my mouth? Do I feel safe? What does the person's swallowing look like? And what does their practice look like? We're going to dive into a majority of these as we kind of go through the evaluation process. But I think, and I'm sure if people are sitting at home, you could probably jot down another 10 easily off the top of your head in terms of other things that matter. But this is a beginning list of just showing there's a variety of things that are part of what to consider when you're thinking about an eating and mealtime experience that might be working really well or one that might be challenging. And then that family routines and roles is sort of that last one that's on this list. I love this quote. This is from, at this point, I know 2007. Is anyone else thinking like, wow, it's 2025? I'm like, oh, this isn't that old. It's actually almost 20 years old. But I love this quote. It's from AOTA, the Sensory Integration Special Interest Section Quarterly. And I love because it really talks about moving beyond just the mouth when we're thinking about eating and mealtime. We're thinking about the child's whole body, their sensory motor profile, the environment, and the context of how mealtimes occur. So I think this quote is really nice because it really highlights that we really want to be thinking beyond just the mouth when we're thinking about eating and mealtime. So this is the theoretical framework we're going to be using that I use when I'm working with individuals, and there's certainly other theoretical frameworks. As I mentioned, my background is in sensory integration as sort of a core element. So this is sort of a natural fit for how I think about the eating and mealtime experience for an individual or a family. So these sort of three cornerstones, which are sensory integration, motor, and psychosocial, are those sort of three cornerstones that I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about eating and mealtime. I will mention that I worked at OTA, the Kumar Center, for many years, and some of these concepts are I co-developed something called the Focus Program for Eating and Mealtime Success, and that was something that we really felt. And I'm mentioning it here because this is reflective of the clinical reasoning process that we developed called Focus. And the reason we ended up developing it was a couple of things. One is, and this gives a little bit of a framework moving forward with what we're talking about, so I want to mention it, is the reason we started thinking about a program to kind of pull together concepts like sensory motor and psychosocial were a couple of things. I had been going to a lot of coursework that was talking about different components of parts of mealtime. So like the SOS course is a great course, and they talk about sort of food interaction pieces, and Deborah Beckman and other courses around oral motor function. So I was going to all these courses and thinking, wow, everyone's presenting really great content and there's all this great treatment and ideas out there. But this idea of how do we pull all these things together was something that I really felt like, for me, took a long time to figure out, even in a very sort of rich environment. And then putting into play when I was teaching other therapists, either that I was mentoring or working with on teams, this idea of it is really hard when you go to courses and things are really segmented. So our vision was to start not to develop some new treatment approach, but how do you pull together concepts? I think that'll be reflective in some of the slides we're going to talk about today. So that was happening actually at the same time that avoidant restrictive food intake disorder was coming out as a diagnostic in the DSM, and it was hard to believe that was 2013. Talk about years passing, but those things were kind of happening, and I really felt like we needed it as a profession to have more of a theoretical sort of clinical reasoning model, and we needed a way to articulate what occupational therapists did, because the community was going to be changing as this new diagnostic came out. And we were right, that did change quite a bit in the Boston area. And, you know, really having a clear vision of what occupational therapy brings to the table on a team working with someone with ARFID became really important. So if you're interested in focus, you're welcome to reach out to me directly. There's my contact information at the end of these slides. The Spiral Foundation, which is a nonprofit associated with OTA, the Kumar Center, also has some great content. So if you're looking, if this is of interest and you want to kind of dive in deeper, those are some resources you can use. Okay. I hope my speed is okay. I'm a little bit of a fast talker. So sensory integration. So this is just like a little dabble into like, why do these things matter? So you'll see here, you'll see a couple of beginning concepts of why we're thinking about sensory integration. Can an individual filter and respond the senses related to foods? What does their arousal state and mealtime participation look like? Do they have awareness of food in their mouth? And we know from the literature that sensory processing skills are well documented in terms of having impact on eating in mealtime. This first one is from the third version of the SI Theory and Practice book, which really talks about one of the feeding in mealtimes is one of the most widely documented ADL areas impacted by sensory integration differences. And you can see from these other articles that you can see there's some different, I like that I picked a selection here because I like the idea that they're not just talking about sensory sensitivity, that there's also talking about sort of this oral or sensory discrimination capacities, which we're going to talk about. So I think this idea of it's multifaceted is really important. And then from a motor perspective, you know, does the person have graded controlled breathing? Can they maintain a seated position? What does their skilled use of hands look like for utensils? And what do things like chewing and drinking patterns look like? And similar to the sensory piece, this is well documented in the literature. Kay Toomey talks about immature motor, oral motor, or swallow skills as being one of the main reasons children do not want to eat. I think that's a really powerful statement in terms of the reason we do need to look beyond, not just sort of like sensory sensitivities, but other components. And then this other book, which I just love, I always forget the title. So it's Autism Interventions Exploring the Spectrum of Autism, has this great chapter on sensory-based oral motor feeding differences. And this is a great quote from that really, I love this, that it pushes that lens out in terms of thinking about not just the mouth, like I was saying, but far beyond. And then psychosocial, you know, this sort of the social participation within meals, the roles and habits and routines that exist within meals. And this is one we're just going to kind of briefly touch on today, mostly because it's so broad. Again, these things could be entire courses on their own, but I think making sure we're always thinking about this factor to think about sensory motor are super important. But if we aren't thinking about this component, you know, meal times are still going to be stressful and probably not meeting the goals of that individual family. The one thing that I do think is interesting with the psychosocial components is that things can kind of move in different dynamics, right? So meal times can create positive psychosocial opportunities, right? And things they can create positive ones or negative ones, and you know, mealtime struggles can have impacts on psychosocial differences and vice versa. So I think that's sort of an interesting component of this area. one of my former colleagues at OTA and I have been talking about developing a workshop that really dives into this at a higher level. I do think Marcia Dunn Klein's Get Permission Institute has some really great content on this, more on responsive feeding and those kind of concepts. So if that's of interest, that might be another resource to kind of check out. And there is, there's some really great information out there to kind of fit into these sort of three main theoretical frameworks when you're looking to kind of learn and how to plug things in to these different areas. So in the literature, not surprising, there's a lot of information about themes like family routines, how the families experience meals, and the parents, the impact of the parents' value and experience with mealtime as being some really common themes. And the two articles that are focused on these mealtime models are two great articles that I would definitely recommend taking a look at. The Roll one is a white paper on responsive feeding, which is fantastic. And the Smith article is on the family meal model, and it really looks at a way of thinking about like what things can support family mealtime and what things can really impact. And so it's really, I think sometimes as therapists, I know I have this experience also that you're zooming in on the client, the individual, but that idea, I think specifically with mealtime, really needs to kind of push that lens out so we can look a little bit more broadly. Okay. So this is the data-driven decision-making model, and this is the process that's used in a wide variety of therapeutic approaches. If you're familiar with the Clinician's Guide for Implementing Air Sensory Integration, Roseanne Schaff and Zoe Melo use that in that book. And one of the reasons Teresa May Benson is the person that I co-developed Focus with when we were at OTA. We were really drawn to this because I think similar to sensory integration, there's like these big concepts and there's all this information. It's like, how do you give some structure on how to kind of organize that information and move through it in a more systematic way, especially when you're learning it. So I love this for that reason. So today we're going to briefly touch on step 1, which is more the intake process. We're going to spend quite a bit of time on step 2, which is evaluation. And then we're going to briefly touch on step 3. And we're going to talk about steps 4, which is the goal piece, and briefly touch on sort of 6, which is that like entry point for therapy. So so this is sort of a comprehensive look of all the steps. We're going to kind of focus a little bit more on the evaluation and sort of the entry points to services. So I hope that works for everybody. I feel like this doesn't work for everybody's brain. So if you're like, this doesn't really speak to me, that's totally fine. I just feel like sometimes having some systems behind where you're talking about a wide variety of content, similar to what I was describing of when I was taking courses that didn't necessarily, no one was saying this is how this all fits together. My responsibility was to figure that out. So I think trying to figure out some frameworks of how to help others with that is something that feels important to me. Okay. We're going to talk a little bit about we're going to talk a lot about the evaluation process, but I want to give a couple of thoughts on evaluation first. For me, looking at an evaluation, I'm looking at sort of what a person brings in terms of their strengths, what their needs and what they want to get out of therapy, what supports exist and what barriers exist. So I'm looking sort of comprehensively at those. And I would say quite often when I work with individuals, someone might get sent, oh, we need OT for feeding, and you start talking to the parent and there's other things going on. So this evaluation process can be a time for families to learn that sort of the breadth of what OT can do and start to connect the dots between, oh, those sensitivities my child experiences with eating are also correlated to some other sensitivities they're exhibiting, and the same therapist can help us with those. A few thoughts on evaluation that I have. A friend of mine's like, is Lori's little soapbox? Okay. So a couple of things is I feel pretty strongly that it's really important to have a comprehensive evaluation. And the reason is that not everyone doesn't not eat for the same reason. And we're going to use a couple case examples of this today. So I think this idea of how do we get information and how do we connect that evaluation information to function, right? So when you're trying to understand a person's sort of sensory discrimination abilities, how are you connecting that to a functional capacity in terms of how it relates to that individual? So because plenty of people, I'll use myself as an example, I have not the best posture and not the best controlled rated breath, but eating is not tricky for me. So it's not an always thing. It's not always, you have this area of need that's, how is it connecting to function? So that feels really important to me, so that we're making sense of how we know it, so we can explain that to parents, clients, other team members. The other thing that I feel like is really important is, if we don't or can't assess an area, it's not really that possible to treat it. So I think, there might be things in here as we're going through the evaluation that you're like, oh, I know that area really well. I already have a great way of understanding it, and I have treatment modalities. That's great. But today, things might pique your interest in terms of like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. That's something I want to learn a little bit more about. So I'm hoping this is sort of an interesting webinar in that way. Okay. So step one is identifying functional mealtime abilities and needs. This is really your intake. You're gathering information about their functional eating and mealtime abilities and needs, so that you can this starts to guide the evaluation process. So tools you might use, I've always worked places that we have families fill out paperwork and have a phone call with a therapist, so that we're really collecting information. And that might include family, sometimes it's including a team member or the individual, depending on how old the person is. And for me, at this point, I really want to start that zooming out beyond the meal. So I'm not just going to ask questions about food. At OTA, when we're updating some intake paperwork, like, gosh, how do we add the food part on, and how do we do this? So essentially, we asked everybody the same whole body sensory motor areas. And then we had a section at the end that was like, if your child experiences or you experience eating in mealtime, if you have goals in this area, fill out this section too. And what that did is it gave us a broad picture, and it also introduced to the family that, oh, there are other things. And sometimes even by the time if they got to the evaluation, they were like, oh, there's these other things that we kind of didn't realize OT did. So you're helping again to connect the dots. This might be a time that you're also reviewing other resources like evaluations, reports, IEPs. Often to get a broader snapshot of the individual, but also sometimes you can rule out areas you don't necessarily need to look at. So maybe they had a really great school evaluation that looked really carefully at their fine motor skills. So you already have great information on that. So you might put it in the context of the evaluation, but you don't have to necessarily do a bunch of evaluation during the evaluation session. All right, so step two, we're going to spend a good amount of time in this area. So we'll kind of do a general introduction, and we'll kind of dive into some different areas that you might look at. So this is getting to the why. That's what an evaluation is to me. I want to know why this person is experiencing what they're experiencing. And that includes their strengths, but also what those areas of needs are that are impacting their functional abilities. So things you might use depending on the setting that you're in, or who that individual is, how much time you have, all those factors. Standardized testing is an option. Using clinical assessment or observation of functional skills, report and interview, checklists and questionnaires are options, and then also exploring responses to strategies. So I had an evaluation last week with a teenager, and interview was our sort of primary entry point. And I have the plan to keep collecting information in different ways. We did some test items, but her comfort level was more than interview because she was anxious about the assessment. So, I think part of it is like showing up with what actually works for the person. And, she was actually saying even by the end, I think the next time I see you, we could do a couple other things. So I felt like I had good information to get started, but also was really respectful of this person is very anxious about being assessed. And I want her to have a positive association with me, so that she wants to do therapy, and I'm not sort of activating that anxiety for her. So these are some areas that using this sort of theoretical framework that we talked about that I would look at during evaluations. I would look at their sensory processing abilities related to sensory modulation and discrimination. And I would look at their whole body capacities in this area and their oral motor abilities. Look at their posture and respiration, their praxis, their oral motor skills, their eating and feeding skills, their fine motor skills. And then the family interactions and psychosocial components and mealtime behaviors. We'll talk a little bit about what that looks like in the context of evaluation, but I'll briefly say here, I do feel like those are ones that you're often learning about over time, especially the sort of the family interaction pieces. And the mealtime behaviors, you're often trying to understand the behavior and how it's connecting to some of these other areas. It's not a listing a behavioral list that's saying like, oh, this person has sensory defensiveness, and therefore, it makes sense that they're getting up and moving away from the table when there's food there that's overwhelming for them. So you're trying to kind of connect those dots. So whenever I show this, if we were in person, someone might ask the question, people are like, how do you look at all that stuff? Like, how many hours are you spending? And this can be really different from, like I mentioned, that teenager. Even if I had hours and hours, I might not have, I still might have some questions after our evaluation period. I have had the experience of having long extended assessment periods, like 2 to 4 hours. And I also have spent the last 4 years of my career mostly doing 45-minute assessments. So the sort of shorter snapshot, this is why looking at other reports, prioritizing things, I personally don't do really long test batteries. I'm not currently using anything like the Easy or the SIPT. I'm going to do something shorter to be like, all right, what's the primary profile? And then, over time, do I need to be collecting more information through more structured testing? So, and you can kind of prioritize, like I said. So most people that I work with, fine motor skills are not the main reason that they're not eating. So I might say, okay, that might be important in the future when we're actually talking about utensil use, but that's not what we're talking about right now. So it's okay to kind of put that one aside when we're looking at other areas. Okay, so what I want to kind of talk about here is the next set of slides is going to be, they're all kind of structured the same way. If anyone has, I'm definitely a print and have the slides out person. If other people are, they might have their slides in front of them. If not, I'll just review that sort of the format for these. The slides that we're going to talk about in evaluation are, they're going to be a sort of an area that we might look at, and then how, if that person has differences in that area, what it might look like, and then some assessment tools. So this is like a broad snapshot of things, and I hope that like it piques some interest. Again, the vision that we had for Focus wasn't to be like, here's all this brand new information. It's how to kind of plug information in. So I hope as we're going through this, people can be like, yep, I'm really comfortable with that from like an assessment perspective, or, oh, I hadn't really thought about that. I want to keep learning and thinking about this. So this is more like an introduction. So we start with the whole body piece. So whole body sensory modulation, I have two definitions here, the definition of modulation and defensiveness, just because they kind of go hand in hand. And we know when people have differences in this area, it can really have huge impacts on meals. Arousal state can impact on hunger cues. It can be hard to regulate and focus during mealtime. A lot of clients that even sitting in the room is really tricky because they're overstimulated sometimes by sensory input within the context of the environment, but also cumulatively during the day, excuse me. A person that has sensory modulation differences might do better eating alone versus in a social setting because they can kind of, there's not as much environmental stimulation as there would be in a social setting versus being alone. And some tools that you might use to gather information on this would be sensory questionnaires, like the sensory processing measure. I use a lot of interview and the intake paperwork. I would put in that sensory questionnaires piece if you have sections on that. And then if I did have a longer evaluation, or I had a client that I felt like I was figuring out how to connect with them, I might use response to regulating activities. So my favorite one that I have stories on, which is more than one person, is teenagers that I work with that, I'm sure if anyone works with teenagers, the parents show up with the kid and they're like, I don't want to be here, arms crossed, slumped on the couch, and like, great. And I had a couple of teenagers that I was like, all right, I'm throwing out anything I thought I was doing. I just want this person to like see that we can do some things that feel good for their body. And when I was at the clinic, the spandex hammock was definitely a go-to because it works so often, and they'd get in there and be like, oh my gosh, this feels so good. So I was getting some information about how they were responding to it, and I was finding the opportunity to kind of connect with them and give some meaning in the evaluation that actually worked well. And then, so the next area we're going to talk about is whole body sensory discrimination. So this is that identifying salient temporal spatial qualities of sensory input that we use and process for skills. the three major senses that I'm thinking about when I'm looking at sensory discrimination is I'm looking at their tactile sense, which is the idea of like, if you relate it to eating, can I form my hand around the utensils? Your proprioceptive sense, which is your body awareness sense, that might be, can I drink from a cup and I can tell how much water is in this so I don't spill it on myself? And from a vestibular system, your vestibular system is connected to your posture and your sequential actions you need for eating. And it actually has a really strong impact on your regulation. I've never worked with anyone that has restrictive eating patterns or mealtime challenges that does not have a vestibular processing difference. So it's super common. Anyway, kind of interesting. And then I would actually put, I'm going to put interoception here just for the sake of talking about it, but that idea of, can individuals pay attention to hunger cues, full cues, those kind of things. And like I was saying earlier, that cumulative effect of, if I can't read body cues of how I'm experiencing things, what does that do for my arousal state? I haven't put my cup down. We think about sensory discrimination differences, right? How does it impact the effort the person needs for self-feeding? Are they spilling and knocking cups over? That can have different reactions for different people. Like for older clients that I work with, sometimes that's embarrassment. And sometimes it's certain family members, that can be something that's the family might already be under stress with the meals, and now you have someone that's spilling things in addition to. And other things you might see during meals is a person to sit on the edge of the chair or fall off the chair. So some ways I might collect information on this might be through Ayres clinical observations, a motor skill test that you can interpret to understand their sensory processing ability. So the Brunick's or the Peabody, the SIPT or the EASY, and then as secondary tools to collect information, but not to replace like an in-person test. You could use a checklist like the sensory profile and the sensory processing measure. All right, we're going to talk about praxis next. So praxis comes from sensory discrimination. And this is the ability to plan unfamiliar motor tasks, is sort of the definition here. I always see a typo. I can see one there. I extra parentheses. That's okay. I'm going to let it go. So for praxis, when we think about how this impacts eating and mealtime, when I wrote this, I kind of like the fact the first two are kind of the same wording, like things that really speak to me with kids with praxis differences, like increased effort, they like need more help or they really can't figure things out. And that could apply depending on the age of the person and who they are, like how do they know how to prepare food? And how do they approach novel foods for utensil use, right? So I had a child years ago that like really even figuring out, he wanted to eat a sandwich, he really didn't know how to put his hands around it. So there's a really practical way of thinking about praxis coming into play. A person with praxis differences might really benefit from assistance and adaptations for preparing food. Just, things being cut up the same way, so they only have to do the same motor action to pick that up versus like scooping versus stabbing, all those kind of things that are different motor plans. And the other piece that I think is huge and quite frankly often underrated is the cumulative impact of overall praxis challenges on individuals. So we're not talking about just praxis during the meal times, but how much work they're spending navigating the classroom and their environment and figuring out how to get dressed and all those things. So those things can have a real cumulative effect and impact. From an assessment tools perspective, the SIPTs and the EASY are both great tools. And the goal, which I always forget what it stands for, is the goal-oriented assessment of life skills, which has some really great praxis activities on it. I love Ayres clinical observations because it's really quick, and functional observations of this can also be really great. So if you're in a setting that you're doing observation of an individual, you can kind of watch and see what their practice and motor planning skills look like. So posture control and respiration. We would want to look at these in terms of, what's their mobility and balance of muscles, and what does coordinated breath look like. Like I said earlier, it's not always a person has an issue in this area and absolutely impact mealtime, but if someone's showing up for services around eating and mealtime, I think this is when we really want to look at in quite a bit of depth, because it can really be impactful from a experience perspective and a safety perspective. So if the person has differences in this area, it might be that they have increased effort for upright posture, so they really might benefit from a supportive chair or adapting the length of the time for meals. I have a couple kids that I work with that, just setting up just from like a treatment perspective of, while we're working on their posture, even with the supportive chair is hard, how do we kind of prime their muscles to get able to sit? And then how do we do, the family that I see does like they all eat for 10 minutes and then they do like a dance party and they all sit back down. That was actually their idea, not mine. So I love that idea. How do we, instead of like sit down in your chair and eat, how do we actually adapt? And but if an individual does benefit from adaptations, that's kind of where treatment and evaluation of like a natural touch point. Difficulty coordinating their breath while eating or drinking. Postural differences can impact the skilled use of hands for utensils, and can have an impact on regulation state. I'm sure everyone has tools that they use to assess this. Some ones that I like are the AIRS clinical observations. I like the gross motor sections of the motor skills, particularly if you're kind of using a lens of observation. So like some in the AIRS observations too, like that sort of the specificity of like, are they holding prone extension and how are they holding it? Are they holding their breath? Are they over recruiting through certain muscles or hiking their shoulders? Really looking at those quality pieces that are giving us a lot of information. I love those initial tests, and as you can hear me talking, I think sometimes it can kind of get into like the nuanced postural pieces that are really important for us to look at. So I know at OTA we had some postural screenings. I currently use those in my own practice because I think the nuance of posture is really important to look at. I also think looking at respiration during a variety of activities is great. So I want to see what kids' breath looks like, when they're eating, but also when they're running around and doing other activities, so I can get a sense of like, where are they activating from? Is it rhythmical? How are they using during activities like blowing up a balloon or blowing through a whistle? Sometimes you get a little bit more information about how they're doing with those tasks. All right,
while you're talking about that, sorry, we just have a question on, while you're on the topic, she is asking, can you speak more to what you are seeing with vestibular difficulties in kids with feeding difficulties?
Yeah, absolutely. Might get me a little bit on a little tangent here because it's like so interesting. So this is one of those areas that for me was like, oh, I'm seeing this and why am I seeing it, right? So you go with what you, for me, I go into like what do I know? What do I know about the vestibular system and like its connections? So the posture one is a pretty common one that people know. Your vestibular system connects to your postural control. So like, okay, that's a pretty clear one. And then I was seeing a lot of individuals that I really felt like they're just like their oral motor skills were really also sort of a primary, like they were showing this sort of cluster of like vestibular discrimination differences and a lot of oral motor eating challenges. So I've had interesting conversations with people, including Mary Kowar, about this to be like, what do we think it is? So I think this gets into like when you see more kids, you can kind of flesh out like, what do I think is going on? So a lot of, I wouldn't say anyone specifically sort of, I'm going to say over or under responsive, even though I don't like those terms, but I think people know what I'm talking about. The kids that get like super dizzy or the people that could spend forever. There's something about this system in terms of how it's influenced by the regulatory system and how it connects to sequential actions for things like eating and chewing. And actually, I didn't put it in the citations here, but if anyone's interested, I found this super interesting article about connections of the vestibular system to the tongue when I was doing some research for a different course. But it has all these really strong connections, but it's not something that you can be like, oh, I looked it up on AOTA and I immediately found an article on this. It's like when you work with kids, you start to like see these patterns and you're like, I wonder what that is. And that for me, that gets me into the neuroscience and what do I think is going on. But I do think a big part of it is the connection to the regulatory system, which we're not going to go into today, but if it's an interest, I would look up that topic. And it is super interesting just to think about. I think at least when I was in OT school, when I was in beginning in the SI world, I was thinking more like vestibular system, more around motor and like gravitational insecurity. And I think what we're realizing from the neuroscience is that there's a lot more connections in that. I hope that enough information.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah. That's one of my nerdy glory topics. So I'll try to keep it as consolidated as possible.
Right.
We're not going to talk too much about fine motor here because, you know, I feel like most people are most OTs are knowledgeable in this area. The one thing I always like to comment on here is there's some sensory pieces that I think fall, like, you know, there's a difference between having a hand musculature difference versus I don't have great tactile awareness and can't form my hand around objects versus I can't grade my action, which is proprioception, right? So I think my training is in sensory integration. So I'm always going to look at things for that lens, but I do work with kids that have fine motor differences, sometimes when it's related to mealtime and sometimes beyond, excuse me. But I feel like this is one, like that nuance of like, what do I actually think is going on so I can provide effective treatment that's going to support their fine motor skills for whatever it is they need to be able to do. Utensil use, writing, whatever the thing is. Okay, we're going to talk about oral sensory modulation. So the reasons it's separated from the whole body piece is a couple reasons. One is from like a clinical reasoning perspective, really zooming in on what's actually going on, right? Is it more around whole body? And by whole body, I mean like overstimulated by visual things and sensitivities to light and body sensitivities to clothing and those kind of things. We really want to zoom in on what the oral piece is. And the other reason, which we're not going to have time for today, but it's another exciting topic, is the cranial nerves and why that's oral sensory modulation and whole body sensory modulation are not exactly the same thing. If that's an area of interest, the Moore book by Patty Otter and Eileen Richter is a fantastic introduction to this, and they're amazing teachers if you ever have a chance to learn with them. So essentially what we're talking about here is that same sensory modulation and defensiveness, but we're talking about it within the oral structures. Taste, texture, I feel like you could put smell in either of them. Those are the things that we're talking about. So the individuals that you work with that have sensory modulation differences related to oral structures might have really strong reactions to novel foods. So that might be gagging, vomiting. Avoidance is obviously a big one. Gagging on utensils. In social situations where familiar foods aren't available and unfamiliar foods might be present, might be really challenging or avoided. So a couple ways you can gather information about this is a food list. I often think is one way. Interviewing the client and the caregiver is really important. And then using some questionnaires that collect information about the oral experience. And there's the PEDI-EAT, PEDI-EAT, which is on Feeding Flock. They have some really great free screenings on there and free information. They have some things. And then the focus screening is something I developed at OTA when we were having a lot of kids that were coming in that were like, you're doing the SIPT and you have to get oral motor information. I was like, how? So it's a kind of a quick and dirty five activity thing, and it helps you kind of collect information on a variety of areas, including sensory modulation. But I think this idea of collecting information on this does feel important. And you'll probably notice in this one, and also with the whole body sensory one, I don't talk about doing like exposure. That's not within the scope of sort of a sensory integration lens. I used to have families bring in, I would say I don't do this never. I'd have families bring in foods that were like not preferred foods to like do interactions with. The primary reason I started moving away from that was two reasons. One was time, right? That could take 10 or 15 minutes. But the biggest one was it was really anxiety provoking for a lot of my clients, to the point that you'd come out to get them. I was new, they didn't know anything about me. And they'd be like shaking in the waiting room. Mom has this food in there. I don't want to eat it. And I remember thinking, is this worth it? The things that I did think I got out of it were sometimes for some people, like if they, I could start to model different ways to help them understand ways to interact with food that did feel successful. So, and those are big wins. I don't think they're things you want to be dismissive of, but I think from a time perspective and like knowing that those things, I could start my current care model as I evaluate and start treating right away. So there's not a gap. So if I'm thinking like, okay, I can do this in the near future, I'd rather start to build a relationship and have that child feel really safe and secure with me, and not pushing something that feels possibly overwhelming on day one. Okay, next we're going to talk about oral sensory discrimination. And this is that same understanding salient temporal spatial qualities, but as they relate to the oral structures. So this is that sort of tactile proprioception, taste, and again, you could kind of put smell in here too if you wanted. And it's separated from the whole body sensory discrimination for the same two reasons that the oral sensory modulation is sort of separated from the whole body piece. This is actually super common, and I'm just going to point out, you can sort of see this list, but the one that I always like to kind of highlight here is may contribute to restrictive food choices. I know I've had a client of varying ages that come in. The parents either think it's a sensory sensitivity or it's an adult and that's what they think it is. And you start assessing them and you're like, there's nothing that's suggestive that it's a sensitivity. But because people read those, like they read things, right? They're like, oh, I have restricted food choices, I must be sensitive. And really what it is they can't feel the food in their mouth, which most of us, the thing I always picture is not exactly the same, but like how when you try to eat or do something after you go to the dentist and had Novocaine, it's not the same exact experience, but that's the one for me has the most like meaning attached to it, to be like, oh, right, when that happens and you're like, where's the food? Am I biting my tongue? Am I going to choke on this? You know, that's the one that sticks with me from a experience perspective. So when I'm thinking about how these individuals experience, and that's my own personal thing that I can kind of ground into. The other thing that's interesting with this, I went into a little bit more detail because it's mealtime related, but people with sensory discrimination differences in general, right, can be the like, with oral function, you know, it can be that they're super slow eaters and they can also be fast eaters. And it's the same thing with the whole body sensory discrimination, right? You have a kind of child that doesn't understand that body that well, and they could be the like, I'm climbing up the ladder and moving really slow and cautiously, or it could be like they don't understand their body and they're moving super fast and unsafely. So it's really interesting to me how these profiles can show up in a really different way. So I think that sort of nuance of like, what do I actually think is happening? So again, so I can start to move towards targeted intervention. And you'll see there's a couple ways that you can gather information about this. I do oral praxis is part of, there's a small piece on the Miller, there's parts on the Easy and the SIPs. If you're not doing any of those, you can do some oral imitation to get some information on that. Okay, oral motor skills. This is the one that I feel, I would say it was my experience, and I think I do a lot of mentoring with individuals that are working on supporting individuals with eating and mealtime goals. And this one is, I think, the one that we all collectively feel the most anxious about, like, I don't know what I'm looking at, like at the beginning. So I think that's a normal part of the process. And, you know, I think one of the nice things when I did work at OTA was when we had a team of therapists, right? You had other people to kind of mentor with and to problem solve with, but also you could have like a hierarchy of who is working with who. So if an individual, a therapist had more training in certain areas, they might be the ones seeing the clients with them. They would be the ones seeing the more complex sort of oral motor clients, versus if it's identified that a person has more sort of more sensory based eating, you know, it might be a therapist that's like newer to learning, so they can build some confidence and some skills in that area. And build towards being able to see clients with oral motor differences as well. So you can see there's a variety of things that show up here in terms of how it can impact mealtime. This is a really profound one. When we look at oral motor skills, we want to look at a variety of structures, sort of all these structures separately and how they coordinate. I think watching kids eat is super important. I think I get so much more information if I can cut for how my brain works to pull it apart and put it back together, right? So, okay, I know that child is fatiguing when they're eating. Why are they getting tired? You know, is it jaw stability, right? Are they really maybe don't lateralize their tongue that well? So it's a ton of work for them to get that food over. Occasionally you see kids that have tethered tissues and you're like, okay, that's in the mix of what's happening. So I think these sort of are key areas that I would look at for an assessment. And different places might use different assessment tools. So the focus screening is one way to get some beginning information, looking at those functional skills. If you've taken any oral motor courses, like the Beckman has a great protocol that I really like. There's questionnaires like the PDE and those things, and then looking at functional oral motor skills. This is actually a way to make assessments fun, right? So like whistles and all those kind of things. So you can do some like functional activities and get some really good information about kind of what's going on from an oral perspective. All right, so we're gonna talk next about, these are the reason they're at the end, these are like the integrated skills of all the things we've already been talking about. So feeding skills, when Teresa and I were developing Focus, we were like, we should get the definitions of AOTA because I think these terms actually get used interchangeably, which I don't have a huge issue with, but when you're presenting, you're like, you should have a definition. So feeding is like the setting up, arranging, and getting the food to your actual mouth, and then the eating is the like breaking down within the mouth. Those are the two definitions. So if someone has feeding differences, they might have a preferred method for getting the food to their mouth. You know, they might like using their hands or have someone else do it. They might need a varying level of assistance, and you might notice more effort. I'm working with a little guy right now that getting food into his mouth is a ton of work for him. So we're working on a lot of the foundational skills that were assessed in those earlier areas versus just practicing getting food into his mouth. You really want to think about the why he's having a hard time with that. Things like specialized feeding materials like cups and plates might be in the mix for this individual. And sometimes, quite often, having foods prepared the same way. So if, you know, if you were eating, I even think for me, like if you're eating different kinds of pasta, if you were like, I'm twirling pasta or I'm stabbing pasta, like there are different motor plans of how you get the food on the fork, but also like how easy is it to get it in your mouth. So if you can make things consistent from like a food prep perspective, so maybe all the food's cubed, so they can use their fingers, or it's food that scoops really easily with a spoon, those kind of things. How do you help them with these feeding skills pieces while you're building capacity in other areas? And looking at direct observation of feeding skills, that could be scooping, stabbing, pouring, opening containers, with all those sort of aspects. And I think from for an older client, sort of the food preparation piece doesn't quite fall into here, but would be an extension of this in terms of like food preparation skills. And then from an eating perspective, we already talked about the definition. These are some differences that you might see in eating a mealtime. And this is really where function is what you're going to kind of come into play. I have families bring in preferred foods with variable meltability and resistance, and just kind of see how this person's actually eating. And then I'm going to connect what I'm seeing here to those earlier areas that we've already looked at. And as I've mentioned here, this is often what brings families to therapy, right? These are the things that are happening that we don't want to be happening for the family. And I think this is one that we're trying to, my biggest thing is trying to connect this to what I already saw so they can stop seeing it as a behavior and more of an outcome of some of the sort of these sensory motor areas. And as I mentioned earlier, we're not going to talk too much about this one, but this idea of, this is not a section that I personally write in reports. It's something that I'm kind of always curious about and trying to weave together understanding. But one thing I do want to highlight on this page is the feeding impact scale, which is another resource on feeding flock, and it has some really great information that I would recommend going to check out. And I love that they have some really nice free resources for people to use. All right, we're gonna talk about two case studies. I picked two different clients that Ali is someone I currently work with, and then Becca, who's the other client we're going to talk about, is someone that I used to work with. So Ali is 8 and has received SI therapy for regulation and coordination. They've had a long history of food choices being limited. They have an anxiety disorder, and their team, when I started working with them, had an SIOT and had mealtime goals related to energy needs and sort of that social environments. And Ali, very importantly, very motivated to learn about food. So when I did an assessment, you know, they'd already done SIOT for a long time, had some lingering mild vestibular processing and bilateral and postural differences. They still benefited from regulation support, so although they really didn't present with, you know, I think that was something they could do and then really stay regulated for a long period of time. Their interoceptive awareness was in okay shape, but still developing. And they had they had functional oral motor skills and oral awareness, and then they had this oral sensory defensiveness related to texture, taste, and smell. And then Becca is an 11-year-old that I work with. And Becca was autistic, had anxiety and a learning disability, and her intake paperwork really reflected a broad variety of sensory motor areas of need. And in addition to the eating and mealtime goals that her parents shared, they also shared that they felt like Becca could use some support with initiation and endurance of tasks, attention, how she experienced everyday experiences like getting dressed, and also just her energy for the day. She was someone when I met her that was napping on a daily basis at school. And the family at the time when I did the evaluation reported that just like family routines and like learning food prep and expanding food choices were goals for them. So Becca was different for a lot of reasons, including where she was in the trajectory of her OT, that she was very interested in the gyms when she came into the clinic. She was not interested in learning about food. So that was another, in addition, there's just some interesting differences between these two. So for her, you can see a variety of whole body challenges that existed for her, and then some pretty significant oral sensory modulation, awareness, and motor skills that were in the mix. So we're going to talk about them in sort of the upcoming sort of steps as well. So we're just going to briefly talk about clinical patterns. So everyone's brain works a little bit differently. This is one that I liked in the data-driven decision-making model, and I certainly like using this as part of focus, because I think this idea of how do we synthesize data and identify meaningful clusters of information, really, really important step. If you think back to those Facebook examples that I mentioned earlier, like how do we plan for intervention? How do we know what goals are achievable? How do we educate the client, family, and team member? We really want to be thinking about what these meaningful clusters are. And because not everyone doesn't eat for the same reason, we really need to kind of zoom in on what those reasons are. So clinical patterns should evolve over time. They're not designed to be stagnant. So if I had met Ollie when they first started SIOT, would be different than how they're presenting now. And Becca, who I left the job that I was working with her, so I didn't get to work with her over through the course of all of her treatment. But that idea of like if I saw her a year later, that clinical profile would likely be different. So we're not going to deep dive into these, but I just wanted to introduce them. These are the ones we developed for focus. So there's whole body patterns and oral patterns, and we're looking at like the most broad ones. So the whole body ones can include oral, but they're sort of like their whole body. It can be whole body and oral differences. So these are written in a progression of sort of complexity, if you will. So for someone like Ollie, even though Ollie has some lingering whole body things, their biggest sort of profile, I would say, is sort of this oral sensory defensiveness. And then for Becca, she would fall under more generalized sensory motor, which means she's experiencing sort of the sensory defensiveness and sensory sort of discrimination and motor differences related to whole body and oral function. So they're kind of at different points, and it makes sense that they have different patterns for a variety of reasons, including that Ollie has received sensory integration therapy for a longer period of time. So this is, even though we're not talking about intervention, I wanted to show this. This is something that we also developed as part of focus and readily handed out at conferences and things. So I feel like we've gotten a lot of good feedback on it. So what this is it's, again, if this isn't how your brain works, totally fine. So, but phase 1 through 6 of treatment and how you kind of can move through and decide, where a client's needs are, where you're going to start therapy. This kind of connects to goal writing and also sort of the entry point of therapy. So I wanted to just mention it. And it's not designed to be like you have to go through all these phases to like be successful. But one of the reasons I wanted to share it was I think it does connect to the goals and the goal writing and the entry point of services. We get a lot of good feedback on this in terms of families being like, oh, I get it. Like if you're writing, most families are coming to see you because they want to see change in phase 6 is the end of treatment. But if you could help them see like we're working on this and it's a building block towards that, that seems to be a really positive way of making sure that they understand that like, no, we're not working on eating in restaurants now, but the skills we're doing are going to work towards that. So it can be looked at that way. Yeah. So, and then the only other comment I want to make is phase 1 is whole body. So that's all of the areas we talked about that, and it's all the sensory and motor areas. So posture, respiration, sensory modulation, all those things fit in that sort of whole body. And then phase 2 oral sensory is the oral sensory modulation and oral sensory discrimination. And if anyone's familiar with the SOS program, the last 3 of these is like using strategies like food chaining and food interactions like they do in SOS. So there's some really great content. We didn't feel like when we developed Focus, we needed to develop like a new treatment idea, because quite frankly, there's some really great stuff out there. What we wanted to do is give something like this that people could use what they already know. So if you're like, I'm SI trained and NDT trained, that fits into phase 1 really nicely, right? And then if you're thinking like, oh, where are the phases that I want to learn, and what are the what people are showing up that I'm working with, and what do I already know, and where do I want to grow is always sort of the question. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about goals next. So using those sort of like clinical patterns, you have those meaningful clusters from your evaluation, and now we're thinking about goals. And I know people do goals differently with families. So, sometimes it's part of the evaluation process. Sometimes it's you get to know the family a little bit and then you write the goals. But I think all these concepts you could really use to connect, no matter how you do your goals. Excuse me. So the key areas we want to think about when considering goal writing is we really want to think about the functional needs and goals of the family, right? So we want to write goals that relate to what is meaningful to them. And as I was saying earlier, like those building block pieces, sometimes, we want our child to be able to eat anything in restaurants, be like, that is a great goal. Here's a building block towards that goal, right? And we want to educate about what we're expecting in the short term. So we're setting them up for success and feeling like therapy is working, and make sure we're moving towards those goals that are much bigger, like a bigger picture goal. We want to think about what sensory motor areas are impacting the eating and mealtime abilities, and to what degree, right? So what are these areas that we identified? How much are they mattering? And so this is something I think we all know it, but sometimes you're like, how do I actually address this, right? How do I take into consideration? So if I had an individual like Becca that's like not interested in food, has a really wide range of areas that are being impacted, I'd be setting us all up for failure to be like, let's write goals around new foods, right? So this idea of what do I know about her and how is it going to influence my goals, which brings us to this next one, which are like, what other factors are in the mix, right? And this can be so different. And this, sometimes I think the first time I write goals with family, this can be one of the harder things, because I'm getting to know the family, but like, what is the family stress level like, right? Is a child taking a medication that's impacting their hunger, right? What are the family dynamics? You learn that, that they have several kids, but then you find out that they have, 3 kids that all have a high level of service and need, and many of them have food allergies and all these other things. I think this idea of all these factors in the mix that we're aware of in the moment, and that continues to evolve over time. And then I think, like, from our relationships with the family, like whatever we know about the client and the family, what can we expect to see change? So again, as you know, families over longer periods of time, like, what does carryover look like for them? How does that child's nervous system change, right? Like, I think people change at different rates. And what do I know about other family members? So things that have come up with me with other family members that might impact what change I'm expecting to see are sort of, is anyone in the family getting mental health support that might be impacting how they're showing up? Sometimes the parents have their executive functioning differences, and that can really impact how we're thinking about how to support them, but also what we're expecting. And then other family members might have things like sensory processing differences and disordered eating, to name a few. So I think there's all these unique factors that we really want to think about when we're thinking about goal writing. And when I'm thinking about goal writing, sometimes I'm often thinking about remediation, but I'm often thinking about, like, what education am I offering? What are accommodations they could be doing? What can we be doing with the skills they have currently? So I'm setting up, you know, a child that's really not eating that many foods, I don't have a magic button to get them to start eating a lot of new food, but I might be working with the family and the dietitian on just how do we get them so they can eat larger quantities of the foods they already eat, so they're getting some energy, some food, excuse me, to meet their energy needs. So this is just an example of if we were talking about a whole body sensory motor pattern, this would be someone like Becca. You know, if you looked at the referral concerns and then sort of how they're presenting in the evaluation, and then the next slide we'll get into what their goals might look like. So for this person, you know, they're having a hard time participating in meals for more than a few minutes, very few food choices and limited intake. They're having a hard time eating in social situations. They're low energy due to food intake. And the family reports coordination differences, but not a reason they're seeking services. That's super important. The client is presenting in the evaluation with whole body tactile, auditory, and visual defensiveness, posture and breath control differences, praxis and coordination differences, oral, tactile, and smell differences, and some limitations in oral motor skills. And so when I'm thinking about goals for this particular person, so I think this piece of like I'm just going to point out that not seeking services for coordination is important. So you'll see this a little bit with Becca as we move through this. So I want to make sure goals are related to what they care about. It doesn't mean I don't work on those areas, but it means how I'm connecting them to function is around the goals that might actually work for them. So a couple of things that I might write for this person. The individual or caregivers will learn 1 to 2 strategies to support regulation and participation in meals. I might write a goal around just being able to sit for longer periods when provided with supports and adaptations as needed. I love goals like that because it doesn't say exactly. I love goals that don't say how you're going to get there, because that could be regulation, it could be posture, it could be a bunch of different things that's impacting that goal. We know that family quality of life is a really important measure of what we're doing. So I might write a goal that says something like family report a 1 to 2 step improvement in mealtime experience using a 7-point Likert scale. So that means when I started writing the goals with the family, and I would say on a scale from 1 to 7, what's your mealtime experience? And they say a 2, jot that down somewhere. And then I'm hoping that we get to a 3 or 4. And again, this idea of I write my goals in like 4-month increments. So I don't always have like a exact, what exactly is going to work. I don't know, but we are going to be thinking about how do I improve the quality of this mealtime experience for this family. I might be writing a goal around learning strategies to increase food intake using preferred foods so they can get their energy needs met now while we're working on some of these other things. And then having an increase of 10 to 20% endurance for the day. So these are just some ideas of some goals that I can write. And you can see they're all connected to what this family cares about, but they're capturing different areas that I might be working on based on what their clinical profile is. And then we're going to do the same thing with someone that has sort of more of an oral motor discrimination pattern. Most clients that show up like this have already had OT, kind of similar to Ollie, but let's just pretend this person just existed. So this person had slow and effortful eating that impacted their food consumption. They're mostly eating foods that don't require a lot of chewing. They have a hard time using utensils and cups that work for them socially. They have limited food choices. And then the evaluation showed some oral sensory discrimination differences and some oral motor differences that impact chewing patterns. So goals for this client might be something like they're going to be able to eat their familiar foods in a timely manner some of the time. I might write a goal that talks about consuming more familiar foods at some meals. I might write a beginning goal on being able to chew small amounts of low resistance food. I might be writing a goal on clearing food from utensils most of the time. For this particular client, of course, like probably all of us were thinking about clients whenever we're talking about horses and things. This one isn't one to me that's necessarily meaningful if it's not meaningful to the family, but this person, the social part for this, it was an older client, the social part of this was really important for them because it was really impacting sort of the messiness factor. I could have easily written a goal around a rating scale on messiness or something like that for this particular person. And then the individual will be able to eat 1 to 4 types of new foods. And I'm going to be basing those foods based on what changes we make in their oral function, right? So you notice I didn't put like high resistance foods, okay, 1 to 4 new types of foods. And I'm going to be thinking, how do I improve their oral function and how do I help them explore foods that are going to match that, the oral motor skills are. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Ollie and Becca. So for Ollie, some goals that I might write for them might be being able to describe food interactions, so using a rating scale or a food descriptor list some of the time. And this was for this particular family, having a platform of how to even interact and talk about foods felt really important. So that's why that was a goal that we used. We talked about a goal might be exploring variations of familiar foods some of the time. I have some great memories of Ollie when we were sort of working on this of Ollie loves bananas and apples. So we were getting really curious about what happens if you put a piece of banana in the microwave for 1 second? What happens if you put it in for 2 seconds? So these sort of small variations as introductory ways of finding ways to interact with those foods was really, really meaningful and fun. And actually, I think it's important for us to have a good time in therapy. I'm definitely smiling thinking of all of our time together, microwaving random things and seeing what happens. Another one for Ollie's family was to learn regulation strategies to use prior to meals to really set them up for success. This is one that took me time to figure out how to support this family in this because they have 3 young kids, Ollie being the oldest. So I think figuring out how do I work with this family in a way that really works for them was really important and took time. Sometimes I think things take time to figure out with families. And then the family's learning strategies to create positive food interactions with Ollie. This is a super lovely, creative family, and I think they really wanted ways to kind of find interactions. And they're both, had 2 working parents and 3 young kids. So how do you create something that actually works for them? So this is something that felt meaningful to them. So we wanted to have it on the goal because it was meaningful to the parents and to Ollie. So Becca. The other part I didn't mention about Becca was so as this family started OT, they were like, oh, we get this. We understand what you're talking about. We understand how this looks for her. We're excited that someone can work on a variety of things. So for her, we made goals eating a mealtime and beyond, in terms of how Becca was showing up in therapy, but also her parents' understanding of what OT could do to support her. So you'll see there's one related to eating a mealtime, which is identifying the family's mealtime routines. And the reason we added that one was that's something I could work with the parents on, right? They realized as a family they needed routine support. So I can work with the parents on that to get ready for when Becca's actually ready for food work. And then these other goals, you can see they're working on foundations that are going to connect to these meaningful areas like comfort with everyday experiences, sustained energy, and participating in like a meaningful gross motor activity. And those are all going to help her with eating, but right now they have context to other meaningful activities for Becca and her family, which is why it was okay for me to write these goals versus that sample goal one that the family didn't care about coordination. These goals might not be applicable because they don't care about these things. I will say when I was writing this, I can't remember what she ended up doing, but they found this amazing art class that was like, I want to call it like improv sword fighting or something. I tried to look up the name of it. I can't find it. It was the most magical thing to hear. She really such a creative kid and really just loved figuring this out. And like she could get some like physical activity and really use some of the skills we were using, developing in sessions outside of it in this activity. And it was really great to see. Okay. Last thing we're going to kind of talk about today is determining the entry point of therapy. We think about the influencing factors here. I want to just kind of say like these can be within your own individual scope, but they can also you can be using a team approach when you're really thinking about things, which I think is important. So you want to think about those clinical patterns and goal areas, which we've already been talking about. What's their area of need and how is it mattering for that person is going to be one thing that's going to impact where we're starting. We really want to be thinking about what their pattern is, and if you go back to that sort of intervention, excuse me, visual, which I did add in the handouts as sort of an extra slide that you have as an extra a bonus handout. So you have like a bigger version of it. You know, where am I starting? You know, I can look at this and be like, this person has these area needs. Where am I starting? And the idea isn't to be like, I have to pick the perfect spot, but it's like, based on where they're at, where am I starting? And then how do I monitor and make sure what I'm doing is working? So I've had clients in the past that if anyone's worked with older clients that don't want to be in therapy sometimes, or they're excited about food, sometimes I'm like, you know what, we're gonna start food a little bit earlier. I'm not going to ignore the first phases, but I might be doing some whole body regulation activities to get them more ready for some food interactions, because I know that window can close on people that they, you know, we're excited about food one day and then we're not excited about another day. So sometimes I might be getting into those food interactions, even for short periods, a little bit earlier. But I always want to be kind of revisiting to be like, do they have the skills they need for this? So if a person has oral motor challenges, I want to make sure whatever food I'm presenting with them, if I am doing food interactions, that it's a safe food. So that's kind of how you can kind of connect some of those phases. It doesn't have to be phase 1 of treatment, phase 2 of treatment, phase 3 of treatment, but that idea of I have to be thinking about all these components. That do they have the skills they need for this, or what am I presenting that's within their sort of skill readiness, particularly when it comes to safety around food. What has the client and family's experience been? I think this is a really important one. So is the person ready and interested in food? So even just Ali and Becca that we've already been talking about, you know, are they ready for this? They might not be. And is the family ready, right? I think Ali's family they're familiar with therapy. Ali was in a good place. They were sort of, you know, you're always grading and figuring out how to support them, but they were ready to kind of be like, we're committed to this. We realize that it's like work to do. So it can be really, I think, just thinking about what their experiences have been and where they're showing up. A lot of the people I work with eating and mealtime, their client readiness, their experiences can really vary. I had an adult that I worked with a couple years ago that, you know, showed up and was like, but I need to be able to eat, right? But everything about her experience from like a sensory perspective and a regulation and safety perspective did not put her in a ready state. So I really needed to work with her and kind of gradually think about how do I support her sort of safety and regulation so she is ready for other parts of therapy. But in the meantime, I really needed to work with her to understand why at least starting from like a body-based strategy place was a good entry point. And then how could we kind of, I don't want to say as quickly as possible because that sounds rushed, but I hear what you're saying, but we're trying food-based work and it was overwhelming for her. So those previous experiences they've had either at mealtimes and what they're, I'm sorry, I'm kind of jumping the gun with talking about readiness together, but those variables in the mix are really important to think about. The client's readiness piece, one of my favorite quotes was from, I had the privilege of working with Jane Kumar for many years, and I still remember sitting with her one day talking about one of my clients who I wanted to be making progress faster than they were making progress. And she said, you can't make a flower grow by pulling on it, Lori. And I think that idea of helping families and individuals see, like, are they ready for these different experiences? And then sort of what are the prioritized area of needs, I think is another one, right? Of families are sometimes really stressed out, or the child's really not eating enough food to like sustain their energy. I think it might impact how you start therapy and the way that you approach things. So if carryover is going to be really important and the family's bought in, or there's some stress within the family system, you know, I want that parent in the session so they're learning the tools that we're doing and at a rate that really can help them support change at home. I'm also always curious about if as a person, these kids that really aren't eating, right? It's scary. Your kid's not eating, they're not getting enough calories in. I don't want to wait till they have fully developed oral motor skills to be able to eat. So I might be thinking of how do I work in, you know, maybe they have a lot of regulation stuff going on. Okay, I really need to work on phase 1. They're really not ready for new foods, but I might be working with the family and the dietitian on the like, how do we how do we use what they can do to tap into those sort of energy needs? And if a person that has oral motor issues, right? Okay, we want to be able to chew and all those things, but in the meantime, how can we present foods in a way that that are softer and easier to eat so they can get that food intake now with softer foods, with the long-term goal of being, as we develop oral motor function, that they'll be able to eat other types of food. So I think there's some like uniqueness that exists within these that are not the same for everyone. And I think it makes our job super interesting, not always easy. So for Ollie, some things that influenced their entry point of services is they'd already had a lot of their sensory integration-based needs met. They had a really strong interest in learning about food, and they just have a really curious mind, and they're ready, and their family felt really ready to be part of this process. And so what that looked like for Ollie to get started was, we use regulation tools as needed to start the session or as a break. We did a lot of food exploration, oral and non-oral, to create tools and positive interactions. And I was collaborating with his SIOT about interception and sort of the lingering vestibular differences, so we could, kind of coordinate on those aspects of care for them. And then for Becca, things that influenced her entry point for therapy were the impact that the whole body sensory motor differences were having on her everyday life. And to be connecting those whole body areas to meaningful goals. That was the foundation for eating as well. So is what's meaningful to this family, and how do we connect these to the wide range of goals that they had. And then the big one for her was like the whole body approach was really the most meaningful way to support Becca, right? She came alive in the playrooms in a way that I remember thinking I was glad I hadn't seen her 10 years before, because I think I was much more ready for sort of the dynamics of what she needed, and feeling really comfortable with educating her family and making sure they understood. And actually, one of the things that I think was the most powerful for me is seeing how that family learned how to just think about their child. And I had a big focus of our work together was the team piece, which I have here also. Sorry, I didn't mention that one with this idea. Oh, sorry, this slide, that's so interesting. I was like, I thought I wrote this somewhere. I did. I went by the slide too quickly. Sorry about that. So what her services look like, where that tapping into her inner drive in the sensory gyms was huge. Like this was just, it was so fun to see her develop over our time together. And she was hilarious. Like she would play games. Like, I'm like, are you playing fetch with me? She's like, I might be, and really prioritizing that engagement and its success, and introducing ideas on what we could work on, right, to Becca and her family. So Becca knew one of the reasons she was seeing me was eventually for food, but we would talk about things and figure out what felt meaningful to them both. The parents' communication and education was just phenomenal. They took information. Mom was connecting stuff with the school team. I was working with the school team on supporting the same sort of goals we were talking about in therapy to support progress. And it was just a really powerful experience as a therapist. All right, so as our time is wrapping up today, I said a couple of sort of key reflections here, hoping people are thinking about what their key takeaways are and how these different sensory integration, motor, and psychosocial factors connect to eating and mealtime. How can you use your evaluation information to tailor goals and entry point of therapy, and what areas related to eating, feeding, and mealtime might you want to continue to learn more about?
So good. We have some questions here in the chat box. Yeah. All right. So it does look like you have your contact information up. So we do have a couple of people asking for the vestibular research, and then if you have any articles or other references on the relationship between the vestibular system and postural control, should I have them just outreach right to you directly?
Yeah, you can absolutely email me and I'll send you. I can't always send the article depending on what you're asking for, but I can, just email me and I'll see what I can do.
Perfect. All right, another question coming in. Do you ever eat with your clients, and why would this be important?
Do I ever eat with my clients?
Yes, that is the question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think based on just what meals are, their sensory, their relationship. So being in in the activity with the person that's sort of the naturalist fit. I also think it takes away, because I work with teenagers, these are some things that I think lots about, that I don't know if anyone's ever been for like therapeutic services themselves, but like the kids eating and me just sitting there watching them, it feels contrived. So I often am eating with the kids. I don't eat gluten, which is an interesting part of my work that's not brand new, but it has changed since I started doing feeding therapy. So if I have a client that I know is going to eat something that I can't eat, I usually bring food with me, as long as it's okay for them. I see clients in their house, which I didn't mention. I worked in a clinic for 20 years and I've been doing community-based work for the last couple. So I usually just bring a food as long as there's no one in the house that has like a food allergy or something. But yes, I often do that. And I would do that during an evaluation also, but also in treatment.
Great. All right, I think you kind of covered this a little bit, but just to recap, what was one of the strategies Ollie's family used?
Which one?
Ollie's family, a strategy that they used.
For which thing?
Oh, so going back, it looks like they're just looking basically for strategies that were used by Ollie's family. Maybe Marcia, if you want to kind of add some more information to that, we can kind of clarify. And while we're waiting for Marcia to respond there, we can cover another one that says, I am working with a child that has been on a feeding tube. His parents want him to start eating. He's drinking from a straw, but mainly water. Do you have any extra tips?
I think just based on the content of our webinar, it's such a good question, but I feel like that's it's just like a little bit beyond what we're going to have time to talk about today. I will say that if you're looking for a good workshop on that, I don't know if I didn't see that on Therapro, but you could look through. But the Marcia Dunn Klein, which is the Get Permission Institute, they have some really great content on that particular topic because they have therapists that specialize in that. So if you're looking to learn, that's a really great platform for some more information on that topic.
Perfect. All right. And Marcia has responded. So did you suggest strategies that Ollie's family could use during their meals?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for that particular family, we would do this is like the dynamics of how families work, right? You're like, oh, food prep would be a really great thing for this family. The family is really busy and they actually don't do most of their own food prep. So kind of figuring out, like, Ollie is the oldest, being helper during meals, ended up like if there were meals the family was preparing or with their nanny, could be interactive with that. The nanny actually spent a lot of time in the room when I'm having sessions with Ollie, just based on how the house is set up. So I feel like she gets a lot of modeling on how to kind of do those kind of activities. And then Ollie and I have been busy recently making visuals on activities that they can do. We have like a playroom in their basement of what are your feel good things that you can do before dinner. The family, trying different things with that family on what works for them from there's like a what's a theory, and then it's like, what does life actually look like? So that's one that's taken some time to kind of adjust and figure out like what actually works well for that particular family.
Awesome. All right. It looks like one more question here. Which intervention do you find are most successful to engage clients prior to feeding? So vibratory input, vestibular input, proprioceptive input.
Ooh, good question. This gets a little bit to like the sensory preferences of like what works for different people. So if I had a client that I was wondering what it was, I'd be spending some time thinking, what do I notice them benefiting from in general? Like, so for some of my clients, like intense, like I have a nephew that does this, but I find too that like spin, 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 and that's regulating for them. I think figuring out what those things that are uniquely theirs are, depending on the client. So if I work with older clients, we're like sitting down and we're trying things, we're figuring out what works the best, we're talking about how it works for their body. But for younger clients, it's kind of our responsibility to be like, what did I notice that worked for them? And then how do I put that into practice, either in sessions or in the home setting? But it's different that's like a personal preference thing. But your primary down regulators are your nervous system, right? Rhythm, deep touch pressure, proprioception. are some of your big, and actually rotational vestibular, but I wouldn't put that in for most people. So there's different things that downregulate your nervous system. So the idea of figuring out what those are, and then figuring out how do you add those again into your session and or in the home setting.